Keep an eye out for the golden star during the video. If you spot it, comment the time you saw it, and you'll get a shout out in our next video. Happy hunting! Zombie outbreak in Maplewood. The town of Maplewood, nestled in a picturesque valley surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills, exuded a timeless charm. Victorian-style houses lined the cobblestone streets, and the town square, with its quaint shops and bustling market, served as the heartbeat of the community. Life in Maplewood was marked by neighborly kindness, self-reliance, and a deep connection to the land. Every year, the Harvest Festival symbolized the unity and prosperity of this tight-knit town. Dr. Clara Henderson had lived in Maplewood all her life. Known for her unwavering commitment to her patients, she was the town's only doctor, a role she embraced with both pride and a sense of heavy responsibility. Clara's days were a whirlwind of house calls, clinic hours, and emergency visits, but she wouldn't have had it any other way. It was a typical autumn morning when Clara received a call from the Harris farm. Mr. Harris, a robust farmer in his late 50s, had returned from a trip to the nearby city feeling under the weather. Clara's initial thought was a simple flu, common at this time of year. She packed her medical bag and set off down the familiar dirt road leading to the Harris property. As Clara arrived at the farmhouse, she noticed an unusual silence. The farm, usually alive with the sounds of animals and activity, seemed eerily still. She knocked on the door, which creaked open almost immediately. "Dr. Henderson, thank goodness you're here." Mrs. Harris's voice trembled as she greeted Clara. Her face was etched with worry, her hands wringing a handkerchief nervously. "What's going on, Sarah?" Clara asked, stepping inside. "It's Henry. He's been sick since he got back, but this morning, it's like he's gone mad," Mrs. Harris explained, leading Clara upstairs. "He attacked me and the kids. I had to lock him in the bedroom." Clara's mind raced as she ascended the stairs. Attacks? This was more than a simple flu. Reaching the bedroom, she heard guttural growls and frantic scratching from behind the door. "Henry, it's Clara. Can you hear me?" she called out, keeping her voice calm but authoritative. The only response was more growling and a thud against the door. Clara carefully unlocked the door, pushing it open just enough to see inside. Henry Harris, a man she had known all her life, was unrecognizable. His eyes were wild, his skin pale and clammy. He lunged at the door, forcing Clara to slam it shut. "Mrs. Harris, get the children and go to the clinic. I need to contain him here," Clara ordered, her mind already working on the next steps. Mrs. Harris nodded, her face pale with fear, and hurried to gather her children. Clara locked the door securely and rushed downstairs to call for help. She needed to alert the authorities and the town about this strange and violent illness. As she dialed the emergency number, Clara's thoughts were a jumble of medical possibilities and personal fears. What was happening to Henry? Was this an isolated incident, or the start of something worse? "Maplewood Sheriff's Office. How can I assist you?" Sheriff Tom Mitchell's familiar voice came through the receiver. "Tom, it's Clara. There's a situation at the Harris farm. Henry is violently ill, and it's not like anything I've ever seen. I need backup and a quarantine team, immediately." "Quarantine? Clara, what's going on?" Tom's tone shifted from casual to serious in an instant. "I can't explain it fully yet, but it's dangerous. Please, just trust me on this," Clara pleaded. "We're on our way," Tom replied, the urgency clear in his voice. As she waited for help to arrive, Clara couldn't help but reflect on her past. Memories of her younger brother, who had died from a preventable illness, flooded her mind. She had sworn never to let anyone else suffer like he had. And now, faced with an unknown threat, that promise felt more daunting than ever. The arrival of the sheriff and his deputies brought a semblance of order to the chaos. They managed to sedate Henry and transport him to the clinic, where Clara set up an isolation room. Despite her medical expertise, she felt a growing sense of dread. The rapid onset of symptoms and the aggression Henry displayed were unlike anything she had encountered before. By evening, news of Henry's condition had spread through Maplewood. Fear began to take hold as more cases emerged. Clara worked tirelessly, but the infection's rapid spread outpaced her efforts. The town that had once been a haven of peace and camaraderie now teetered on the brink of panic. Clara knew that the days ahead would test her in ways she had never imagined. She would have to confront not only the physical battle against the outbreak, but also the moral and ethical dilemmas that came with it. As she looked out over the darkening town from her clinic window, she vowed to do everything in her power to protect Maplewood and its people, even if it meant facing her deepest fears and pushing herself beyond her limits. The calm before the storm had passed. The true struggle was just beginning. The night had barely fallen when the first sirens pierced the heavy silence of Maplewood. Sheriff Tom Mitchell, along with a small team of deputies, arrived at the Harris farm, their faces set with grim determination. Clara met them at the gate, her own face a mask of worry and resolve. "He's upstairs," Clara said, leading them inside. "I managed to sedate him, but we need to move quickly." The team followed her, their boots thudding on the wooden floors, each step echoing the urgency of the situation. They reached the bedroom where Henry Harris lay restrained, his eyes flickering open in a moment of lucidity before clouding over with the same wild, desperate look Clara had seen earlier. "Get him on the stretcher," Tom ordered, and the deputies moved with practiced efficiency. As they lifted Henry, he snarled and snapped, the sound more animal than human. The sight sent a ripple of unease through the group, but they pressed on, securing him and moving him to the waiting ambulance. Clara watched them go, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She had seen infections before, but nothing like this. She turned back to Mrs. Harris and her children, who huddled together in the living room, their faces pale with fear. "You should come with me to the clinic," Clara said gently. "We'll keep you safe there." Mrs. Harris nodded, clutching her children close. "What's happening, Dr. Henderson? Is he going to be okay?" "I don't know," Clara admitted, her voice soft but firm. "But I promise we'll do everything we can to help him." The journey back to the clinic was tense and silent. Clara's mind raced with possible diagnoses, but none fit the symptoms she had witnessed. As they arrived, she saw a crowd gathering outside, whispers of fear and confusion spreading through the town like wildfire. Inside, Clara directed the Harris family to a secure room and returned to the makeshift isolation ward where Henry had been placed. She joined Sheriff Mitchell, who stood with his arms crossed, watching the patient through a glass partition. "What do you think, Clara?" Tom asked, his voice low. "I've never seen anything like this," she replied. "It's spreading fast. We need to quarantine the town and get help from the state health department." Before Tom could respond, the building shook with the sound of a crash. Clara and Tom rushed to the front of the clinic where a group of townsfolk had burst through the doors, their faces masks of panic and desperation. "Dr. Henderson, we need help," one man shouted, holding up his arm, which bore a ragged bite mark. "Something attacked us in the woods." Clara's heart sank. "Get him to a treatment room," she ordered a nurse, then turned to Tom. "This is escalating. We need to act now." Tom nodded and stepped outside, raising his voice to address the crowd. "Everyone, listen up. We're dealing with a serious situation. We need to remain calm and follow Dr. Henderson's instructions." As he spoke, another commotion erupted near the edge of the crowd. Clara pushed her way through to see a woman on the ground, convulsing violently. Blood foamed at her mouth, and her eyes rolled back in her head. Without hesitation, Clara dropped to her knees beside her, shouting for a stretcher. "Hold her down," she instructed a deputy. "We need to get her inside now." The scene inside the clinic was one of chaos. Clara barked orders, her mind working at lightning speed. Patients were isolated as best as possible, symptoms documented meticulously, but it was clear they were fighting a losing battle. The infected were growing more aggressive, and containment was becoming impossible. In the midst of the frenzy, Clara felt a tug on her sleeve. She turned to see young Emily Harris, her eyes wide with terror. "Is my daddy going to die?" Clara knelt down, forcing a calm she didn't feel. "We're doing everything we can, Emily. I need you to be brave and stay with your mom. Okay?" Emily nodded, her lower lip trembling, and Clara squeezed her hand before standing up, her mind racing. "Tom, we need to establish a quarantine zone," she said, turning to the sheriff. "No one in or out until we get a handle on this." Tom nodded, his jaw set. "I'll get the deputies on it. What else do you need?" "Communications. We need to get word to the state authorities and the CDC. This is beyond anything we can handle alone." As Tom coordinated the quarantine efforts, Clara moved through the clinic, her senses on high alert. The groans and screams of the infected filled the air, a constant reminder of the ticking clock they faced. She paused by Henry's isolation room, watching him thrash against his restraints, his eyes wild with a mixture of pain and fury. "We'll find a way," Clara whispered, more to herself than to him. "We have to." Just then, a loud crash echoed through the hallway. Clara spun around, heart pounding, and saw one of the infected had broken free, slamming into a nurse and sending her sprawling. The creature's eyes were glazed with madness as it lunged at the nearest person. "Get down!" Clara shouted, grabbing a nearby fire extinguisher and swinging it with all her might. The heavy metal connected with the infected's head, and it staggered, giving Clara enough time to push it back. "Secure that door," she yelled to a deputy, who quickly complied, barricading the entrance. "We can't afford any more breaches." As the night wore on, the clinic became a battleground. Clara and her team fought to contain the infected, each encounter more harrowing than the last. Blood smeared the floors, and the air was thick with the acrid scent of fear and antiseptic. By dawn, exhaustion had set in, but the immediate threat had been contained. Clara slumped against a wall, her scrubs stained and torn, but her resolve unwavering. She knew this was just the beginning. The infection was spreading, and their small town was on the brink of a nightmare beyond imagination. "We survived the night," she murmured to herself. "Now, we need to find a way to survive the day." As the first light of morning filtered through the clinic windows, Clara rose to her feet, ready to face whatever horrors the new day would bring. Morning sunlight streamed through the clinic windows, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor. Clara felt the weight of exhaustion in her bones but knew there was no time to rest. She took a deep breath and steeled herself for the day ahead. Outside, Sheriff Tom Mitchell had rallied his deputies to establish a quarantine zone around Maplewood. Barricades were being set up, and a sense of unease hung heavy in the air. Townsfolk watched with a mixture of fear and curiosity, their whispers growing louder with each passing minute. "Clara, we need to talk," Tom said, approaching her with a grim expression. "The state authorities are sending help, but it'll take time. We need to hold the line until then." "I know," Clara replied, her voice steady. "We need to keep the infected contained and prevent further spread. I'll focus on treating the patients and trying to find a solution." As they spoke, a loud commotion erupted near the clinic entrance. Clara and Tom turned to see a group of townsfolk, led by a burly man named Jack Lawson, pushing against the deputies' attempts to maintain order. "This is madness," Jack shouted. "We need to get out of here before we all end up like them." Tom stepped forward, raising his hands to calm the crowd. "Listen, I understand your fear, but leaving town will only spread the infection. We need to stay together and follow Dr. Henderson's instructions." Jack's eyes narrowed. "And what if she's wrong? What if staying here gets us all killed?" Clara stepped beside Tom, meeting Jack's gaze. "I understand your concern, Jack, but running will only make things worse. We need to isolate the infected and work on finding a cure. Please, trust us." Jack hesitated, his anger warring with the logic in Clara's words. Finally, he stepped back, muttering under his breath. The crowd began to disperse, but the tension lingered, palpable and thick. As the day wore on, Clara and her team worked tirelessly, treating the growing number of infected and documenting their symptoms. The infection's progression was rapid and brutal, with patients exhibiting extreme aggression and a ravenous hunger. Clara's mind raced with possible treatments, but without more information, it felt like she was grasping at straws. In the afternoon, a new wave of chaos hit the clinic. One of the patients, a young man named Eric, had broken free from his restraints. Clara rushed to the isolation ward to find him attacking a nurse, his eyes filled with a feral intensity. "Eric, stop!" Clara shouted, but he paid no heed. Thinking quickly, Clara grabbed a nearby gurney and rammed it into Eric, knocking him off the nurse. He scrambled to his feet with inhuman speed, lunging at Clara with a guttural snarl. She ducked under his outstretched arms, adrenaline sharpening her reflexes. "Help me restrain him," Clara called out to the nearby deputies. 2 deputies rushed in, wrestling Eric to the ground. His strength was unnaturally amplified, and it took all 3 of them to subdue him. Clara quickly administered a sedative, watching as Eric's thrashing gradually ceased. "Get him back into isolation," Clara instructed, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "We need to make sure this doesn't happen again." The deputies nodded, hauling Eric back to his room. Clara helped the nurse to her feet, checking for injuries. "I'm fine," the nurse said, her voice trembling. "But how much longer can we keep this up?" Clara didn't have an answer. The infection was spreading faster than they could contain it, and resources were running thin. She knew they were fighting a losing battle, but giving up wasn't an option. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in a deep orange glow, Clara gathered her team for a strategy meeting. They needed to come up with a plan to manage the crisis and buy time until reinforcements arrived. "We're on our own for now," Clara began, addressing the tired but determined faces before her. "Our priority is to keep the infected contained and protect the uninfected. We need to strengthen the quarantine measures and continue our research into the nature of this infection." One of the nurses raised a hand. "What about supplies? We're running low on everything." Clara nodded. "We'll need to ration what we have and make a supply run to nearby towns if necessary. It's risky, but we don't have a choice." Sheriff Mitchell added, "We'll also need more volunteers to help with the barricades and keep an eye on the infected. If anyone shows symptoms, they need to be isolated immediately." The meeting ended with a renewed sense of urgency. Clara returned to the isolation ward, her mind racing with plans and contingencies. She checked on Henry Harris, who lay in a fitful sleep, his body restrained to prevent further attacks. "We're going to find a way to fix this," Clara whispered, more to herself than to Henry. "We have to." Just as she turned to leave, a loud crash echoed from the front of the clinic. Clara sprinted down the hallway, heart pounding. She arrived to find the front doors splintered open and several infected pouring in, their eyes blazing with madness. "Fall back. Secure the patients," Clara shouted, grabbing a nearby chair and using it to block the advance of the infected. The deputies and medical staff scrambled to contain the breach. Clara swung the chair with all her might, feeling the impact reverberate through her arms as she struck one of the attackers. The infected stumbled but didn't go down, lunging at her with terrifying speed. In the chaos, Clara spotted young Emily Harris and her mother, cornered by one of the infected. Clara's heart surged with protective fury. She grabbed a fire extinguisher, pulling the pin and spraying a blinding cloud of foam at the attacker. The infected stumbled, disoriented by the sudden assault, giving Clara the chance to drag the Harris family to safety. "Get to the back rooms and barricade yourselves in," Clara ordered, her voice barely audible over the din. Emily's mother nodded, clutching her daughter tightly as they fled. Clara turned back to the fray, her mind a blur of strategy and instinct. The infected were relentless, their sheer numbers overwhelming. "Tom, we need backup now," Clara shouted into her radio. "On our way," came Tom's reply, crackling through the static. Clara swung the fire extinguisher again, the heavy metal connecting with another attacker. She backed towards the clinic's inner rooms, trying to lead the infected away from the more vulnerable patients. The fight was a chaotic dance of survival, each moment a desperate bid to hold the line. Finally, the sound of approaching sirens signaled the arrival of reinforcements. Sheriff Mitchell and his deputies stormed in, weapons at the ready. Together, they managed to drive back the infected, securing the clinic once more. As the dust settled and the last of the attackers were restrained or neutralized, Clara slumped against a wall, her body aching from the exertion. She looked around at the exhausted faces of her team, each one a testament to their determination. "We survived another day," Clara murmured, her voice a mix of relief and resolve. "But this is far from over." Tom approached, his face set in grim determination. "We need to fortify our defenses and prepare for the next wave." "They're not going to stop." Clara nodded, already planning their next moves. The battle for Maplewood was just beginning, and she knew they would need every ounce of strength and ingenuity to survive. As night fell once more, the clinic stood as a beacon of hope and defiance in the midst of the encroaching darkness. Clara knew that the days ahead would be filled with challenges, but she was ready to face them head-on, determined to protect her town and find a way to end the nightmare that had engulfed Maplewood. Night had settled over Maplewood, cloaking the town in an uneasy stillness. The clinic, now fortified with barricades and reinforced windows, stood as a fragile sanctuary against the encroaching horror. Clara knew they couldn't hold out forever. Supplies were dwindling, and the infection showed no signs of slowing down. "We need to make a supply run," Clara said, gathering her team in the dimly lit break room. "The nearest town, Pineville, might have what we need, but it's risky." Tom Mitchell nodded. "I'll take a team. We can use the back roads to avoid attracting too much attention." Clara glanced at the weary faces around her. "Be careful. Every second counts." Tom assembled a small group of deputies and volunteers. They armed themselves with whatever they could find: rifles, shotguns, and makeshift weapons. Clara handed Tom a list of essential supplies and a map of the safest route to Pineville. As they prepared to leave, Clara pulled Tom aside. "Watch out for the infected. We still don't know how it spreads, but direct contact seems to be the trigger." Tom gave a grim nod. "We'll do our best." The supply run team slipped out into the night, moving through the shadows like ghosts. Clara watched them go, her heart heavy with worry. She turned back to the clinic, where the remaining staff and volunteers were fortifying their defenses and caring for the growing number of patients. Inside the clinic, the tension was palpable. Clara moved from room to room, checking on patients and giving instructions. She knew that maintaining morale was as important as treating the infected. The sound of groans and muffled cries filled the air, a constant reminder of the nightmare they were living. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Clara forced herself to stay focused, her mind racing with plans and contingencies. Just as she was about to check on the isolation ward, a loud crash echoed from the rear of the building. "Not again," she muttered, grabbing a crowbar from a nearby toolkit. She raced down the hallway, arriving at the rear entrance to find that one of the barricades had been breached. Several infected were forcing their way inside, their eyes wild with hunger and madness. "Get back!" Clara shouted, swinging the crowbar with all her strength. The heavy metal connected with a sickening thud, and one of the infected fell, but more surged forward. The clinic staff scrambled to defend their position. Nurses wielded fire extinguishers, chairs, anything they could find. The infected were relentless, clawing and biting with a ferocity that seemed unstoppable. In the chaos, Clara spotted young Emily Harris again, her small form huddled in a corner, eyes wide with terror. Clara's protective instincts flared. She couldn't let anything happen to the child. "Emily, get behind me!" Clara yelled, positioning herself between the girl and the attackers. One of the infected lunged at Clara, teeth bared. She swung the crowbar, feeling it connect with bone. The creature staggered back, but another took its place almost instantly. "Hold the line!" Clara shouted, her voice barely audible over the din. The battle was a frantic, desperate struggle. Clara's arms ached from the effort, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. She saw a nurse fall under the weight of an attacker and moved to help, her mind a blur of fear and determination. As Clara fought, she realized they were being pushed back towards the inner rooms. If the infected broke through, it would be a massacre. She had to think fast. "Tom, we need backup now." Clara screamed into her radio, hoping the supply run team could hear her. Static crackled, and Tom's voice came through, faint but clear. "We're on our way. Hold tight." Clara swung the crowbar again, driving back another attacker. Her muscles burned, but she refused to give in. They had to hold out a little longer. Just as Clara began to feel the strain of exhaustion, a burst of light filled the room. The supply run team had returned, headlights cutting through the darkness. Tom and his team charged in, guns blazing. The infected recoiled under the onslaught, driven back by the sudden reinforcements. "Secure the perimeter," Tom shouted, taking down an infected with a well-placed shot. "We can't let them breach again." Clara breathed a sigh of relief as the infected were pushed back, the clinic finally secured. She glanced around, taking in the scene of destruction and exhaustion. They had made it through another attack, but just barely. As the adrenaline began to fade, Clara leaned against the wall, her body trembling from the effort. Tom approached, his face lined with worry. "We got the supplies," he said, handing her a bag filled with medical essentials. "But it's getting worse out there. Pineville is nearly overrun." Clara nodded, taking the bag. "We'll make do with what we have." "Thank you, Tom." Tom's gaze was steady. "We need a long-term solution, Clara. This can't go on forever." She knew he was right. They couldn't keep fighting off the infected without a plan. Clara's mind raced with possibilities. They needed to understand the infection better, find a cure, or at least a way to slow its spread. "We'll figure it out," Clara said, her voice firm despite the fatigue. "But for now, we need to keep everyone safe and buy ourselves more time." As the night deepened, the clinic staff worked tirelessly to repair the barricades and tend to the wounded. Clara moved among them, offering words of encouragement and instructions. Her mind was a whirlwind of strategies and fears, but she refused to let them see her doubt. In a quiet moment, Clara checked on Henry Harris. His condition had worsened. His breathing labored and his eyes glazed. She felt a pang of sadness and determination. Henry had been one of the town's strongest, and seeing him like this fueled her resolve. "We'll find a way to save you," Clara whispered, placing a hand on his forehead. "I promise." As dawn approached, Clara gathered her team for another strategy meeting. They needed to regroup and prepare for whatever came next. The battle for Maplewood was far from over, and they couldn't afford to lose hope. "We survived another night," Clara began, looking at the tired but determined faces around her. "And we'll survive the next. We need to stay strong and stay united. Together, we can get through this." The team nodded, their resolve mirrored in Clara's own heart. She knew the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but she was ready to face them. For Maplewood, for her patients, and for the hope of a brighter future. As the first light of morning touched the clinic, Clara felt a renewed sense of purpose. The darkness might be closing in, but as long as they had each other, they had a chance. And Clara would do everything in her power to ensure that chance was not wasted. Morning light filtered through the clinic's windows, casting a soft glow over the exhausted faces of Clara and her team. The aftermath of the night's battle had left the clinic in a state of disarray, but there was no time to rest. Clara knew they needed a plan, and they needed it fast. Clara gathered her team in the break room, the air thick with a mix of determination and fatigue. She glanced around at the faces of those who had fought beside her, their resolve mirroring her own. "We can't keep this up forever," Clara began, her voice steady. "We need to find a way to understand this infection, and fast. Tom, you mentioned Pineville is nearly overrun. Did you find anything useful?" Tom nodded, pulling out a small, battered notebook. "We found some notes left by a doctor in Pineville. It looks like they were trying to document the infection's progression and symptoms. It's not much, but it might give us a starting point." Clara took the notebook, flipping through the hastily scrawled pages. "This is good. We'll need to compare these notes with what we've observed here. Maybe we can find a pattern, something we can use to develop a treatment." A nurse raised her hand. "What about supplies? We're running low on everything, and the infected are getting more aggressive. We can't just sit here and hope for the best." Clara nodded. "We need to ration what we have carefully. Tom, can you organize another supply run? We need more medical supplies, food, and anything else we can get our hands on. Tom's face hardened. It's a risk, but we don't have a choice. I'll put together a team and head out tonight. As the meeting ended, Clara felt a heavy burden settle on her shoulders. The weight of responsibility was immense, but she couldn't afford to let it slow her down. She moved through the clinic, checking on patients and reinforcing barricades where needed. In the isolation ward, Clara found Henry Harris in worse condition than before. His breathing was labored, and his eyes were glazed with a feverish intensity. She sat beside him, her mind racing with potential treatments and strategies. "We're going to find a way to save you," she whispered, her voice filled with determination. "I promise." Just as she stood to leave, a shout echoed from the front of the clinic. Clara rushed to the entrance to find a group of townsfolk arguing with the deputies. At the center of the commotion was Jack Lawson, his face contorted with anger. "This isn't working," Jack yelled. "We need to leave town before we all end up like them." Tom stepped forward, raising his hands to calm the crowd. "Leaving won't solve anything, Jack. We need to stick together and follow Dr. Henderson's instructions." Jack's eyes narrowed. "And what if she's wrong? What if staying here gets us all killed?" Clara stepped beside Tom, meeting Jack's gaze with a steely resolve. "I understand your fear, Jack, but running will only spread the infection. We need to isolate the infected and find a cure. Please, trust us." Jack hesitated, his anger warring with the logic in Clara's words. Finally, he stepped back, muttering under his breath. The crowd began to disperse, but the tension lingered, thick and palpable. Clara turned to Tom, her voice low. "We need to keep an eye on him. If he stirs up more trouble, it could jeopardize everything we're working for." Tom nodded, his expression grim. "I'll make sure he doesn't cause any more problems." The day passed in a blur of activity. Clara and her team worked tirelessly, comparing the notes from Pineville with their own observations, searching for any clue that might help them understand the infection. But as the hours dragged on, their progress was slow and frustrating. In the late afternoon, another wave of chaos hit the clinic. One of the patients, a middle-aged woman named Linda, had broken free from her restraints. Clara rushed to the isolation ward to find Linda attacking a nurse, her eyes wild with a feral intensity. "Linda, stop!" Clara shouted, but Linda paid no heed. Thinking quickly, Clara grabbed a nearby tray and slammed it into Linda's side, knocking her off the nurse. Linda scrambled to her feet with inhuman speed, lunging at Clara with a guttural snarl. Clara ducked under her outstretched arms, adrenaline sharpening her reflexes. "Help me restrain her," Clara called out to the nearby deputies. 2 deputies rushed in, wrestling Linda to the ground. Her strength was unnaturally amplified, and it took all 3 of them to subdue her. Clara quickly administered a sedative, watching as Linda's thrashing gradually ceased. "Get her back into isolation," Clara instructed, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "We need to make sure this doesn't happen again." The deputies nodded, hauling Linda back to her room. Clara helped the nurse to her feet, checking for injuries. "I'm fine," the nurse said, her voice trembling. "But how much longer can we keep this up?" Clara didn't have an answer. The infection was spreading faster than they could contain it, and resources were running thin. She knew they were fighting a losing battle, but giving up wasn't an option. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in a deep orange glow, Clara gathered her team for another strategy meeting. They needed to come up with a plan to manage the crisis and buy time until reinforcements arrived. "We're on our own for now," Clara began, addressing the tired but determined faces before her. "Our priority is to keep the infected contained and protect the uninfected. We need to strengthen the quarantine measures and continue our research into the nature of this infection." One of the nurses raised a hand. "What about supplies? We're running low on everything." Clara nodded. "We'll need to ration what we have and make another supply run to nearby towns if necessary. It's risky, but we don't have a choice." Tom added, We'll also need more volunteers to help with the barricades and keep an eye on the infected. If anyone shows symptoms, they need to be isolated immediately. The meeting ended with a renewed sense of urgency. Clara returned to the isolation ward, her mind racing with plans and contingencies. She checked on Henry Harris, who lay in a fitful sleep, his body restrained to prevent further attacks. "We're going to find a way to fix this," Clara whispered, more to herself than to Henry. "We have to." As night fell, the clinic was once again fortified. The staff worked tirelessly to repair the barricades and tend to the wounded. Clara moved among them, offering words of encouragement and instructions. Her mind was a whirlwind of strategies and fears, but she refused to let them see her doubt. In a quiet moment, Clara checked on Henry Harris. His condition had worsened. His breathing labored and his eyes glazed. She felt a pang of sadness and determination. Henry had been one of the town's strongest, and seeing him like this fueled her resolve. "We'll find a way to save you," Clara whispered, placing a hand on his forehead. "I promise." As dawn approached, Clara gathered her team for another strategy meeting. They needed to regroup and prepare for whatever came next. The battle for Maplewood was far from over, and they couldn't afford to lose hope. "We survived another night," Clara began, looking at the tired but determined faces around her. "And we'll survive the next. We need to stay strong and stay united. Together, we can get through this." The team nodded, their resolve mirrored in Clara's own heart. She knew the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but she was ready to face them. For Maplewood, for her patients, and for the hope of a brighter future. As the first light of morning touched the clinic, Clara felt a renewed sense of purpose. The darkness might be closing in, but as long as they had each other, they had a chance. And Clara would do everything in her power to ensure that chance was not wasted. The clinic buzzed with a renewed sense of purpose as Clara and her team prepared to implement the new treatment protocol they had discovered. The makeshift laboratory was a flurry of activity, with researchers and medical staff working tirelessly to synthesize the treatment based on the notes they had found. Clara knew this was their best shot at slowing the infection and saving lives. "We have the basic formula," Clara announced to her team. "Now we need to test it and see if it works. Our first priority is to stabilize the patients who are in the early stages of the infection." Tom stood by her side, his presence a comforting constant. "We've secured the perimeter as best we can. The infected haven't made another attempt to breach the clinic, but we need to stay vigilant." Clara nodded. "We'll need volunteers to test the treatment. It's risky, but we don't have a choice." Jack Lawson, who had been one of the most vocal critics, stepped forward. His face was drawn with fatigue, but his eyes held a steely resolve. "I'll do it. If this can help us fight back, I'm in." Clara felt a surge of respect for Jack. Despite their earlier conflicts, his willingness to volunteer spoke volumes about his character. "Thank you, Jack. We'll need to monitor you closely and document every reaction." The first few hours of administering the treatment were tense. Clara and her team hovered over the patients, monitoring their vitals and recording any changes. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation and fear. "How's he doing?" Tom asked, peering over Clara's shoulder as she checked on Jack. "His vitals are stable," Clara replied, her voice a mix of hope and caution. "We won't know for sure until a few more hours pass." Time seemed to drag as they waited. The silence was punctuated by the occasional groan from the infected patients and the soft hum of medical equipment. Clara felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her, but she refused to let it break her. Suddenly, Jack's eyes fluttered open. He looked around, confusion mingling with pain. "Did it work?" Clara leaned in, checking his pulse and temperature. "It's too soon to say for certain, but your vitals are good. How do you feel?" Jack grimaced. "Like I've been hit by a truck, but I'm not as hungry as before." Clara exchanged a hopeful glance with Tom. "That's a good sign. We'll keep monitoring you, but this might be the breakthrough we needed." Just as they began to relax, a loud crash echoed from the front of the clinic. Clara's heart leapt into her throat. What now? Tom grabbed his rifle. Stay here. I'll check it out. Clara wanted to follow, but she knew her place was with the patients. She watched as Tom and a group of deputies hurried to the front of the clinic, their faces set in determination. Minutes felt like hours as Clara waited for news. Finally, Tom's voice crackled over the radio. Clara, you need to see this. Clara hurried to the front of the clinic, where Tom was standing with a look of disbelief on his face. Outside, a group of survivors had arrived, their clothes torn and faces haggard. Among them was a familiar face. Sharn, Clara exclaimed, rushing forward to embrace her sister. Sharn, Clara's younger sister, had been away at college when the outbreak began. She looked exhausted but relieved to see Clara. I heard about the infection spreading and came as soon as I could. We brought some supplies and more people who need help. Clara hugged her tightly. I'm so glad you're safe. We've made some progress here, but we need all the help we can get. As they helped the new arrivals inside, Clara noticed the wary glances exchanged among the townsfolk. Trust was fragile, and fear was a constant undercurrent. She knew that integrating the newcomers would be a delicate task. We'll set up an isolation area for the new arrivals, Clara instructed. We need to make sure none of them are infected. The rest of the day was a blur of activity. The new supplies Sharn's group had brought were a godsend, bolstering their dwindling resources. Clara moved through the clinic, coordinating efforts and checking on patients. The treatment seemed to be having a positive effect on Jack and a few others who had volunteered. By evening, the clinic had settled into a tense but hopeful rhythm. Clara found a moment to sit with Sharn, catching up on the events that had brought her back to Maplewood. It's chaos out there, Sharn said, her voice low. Cities are falling apart, and people are desperate. We barely made it here. Clara squeezed her sister's hand. We're making progress. We found some research that might help us slow the infection. It's not a cure, but it's a start. Sharn nodded, her eyes filled with determination. Whatever you need, I'm here to help. As night fell, Clara gathered her team for another meeting. The presence of the newcomers had brought a mix of hope and anxiety, but they needed to stay focused. We've made progress today, Clara began, addressing the weary but determined faces around her. The treatment is showing promise, and we've gained valuable resources and allies, but we can't let our guard down. The infected are still out there, and we need to stay vigilant. Tom stepped forward. We'll organize patrols to keep an eye on the perimeter. We can't afford any more breaches. Clara nodded. And we need to keep working on the treatment. Document every reaction, every change. The more we know, the better our chances. As the meeting ended, Clara felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had taken significant steps forward, but the battle was far from over. She knew they couldn't afford to rest, not while the threat of the infection loomed over them. In the quiet of her makeshift office, Clara reviewed the research papers once more. The treatment was a start, but they needed more. More data, more resources, more time. We're going to make it through this, she whispered to herself, determination hardening her resolve. For Maplewood, for Sharn, for everyone. As the night deepened, the clinic stood as a beacon of hope in the midst of darkness. Clara knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but she was ready to face them head-on. Together, they had a chance, and she would do everything in her power to ensure that chance was not wasted. The dawn brought a hushed tension over Maplewood. The town had rallied around the hope of the new treatment, but Clara knew they were running out of time. The infected were growing more aggressive, their attacks more frequent. The clinic, now a fortress of hope and fear, buzzed with activity as preparations were made for the next onslaught. Clara stood in the makeshift lab, her hands steady as she mixed the latest batch of the treatment. We need to be ready, she said, glancing at Tom, who stood nearby. The infected are not going to wait for us to catch our breath. Tom nodded, his face grim. We've fortified the barricades and set up additional watch posts. If they come, we'll be ready. Clara finished her work and looked around at her team. They were exhausted, but their eyes burned with determination. Let's make sure this is ready for when they do. As the sun climbed higher, the tension in the air grew. The townsfolk worked side by side, reinforcing defenses and preparing for the worst. Clara moved among them, offering encouragement and overseeing the distribution of the treatment to those who needed it most. The calm before the storm was shattered by a sudden, piercing scream. Clara's heart raced as she turned toward the sound. From the edge of the town, a wave of infected emerged, their eyes wild with hunger. They moved with a terrifying speed and ferocity, a force of chaos and destruction. "Here they come," Tom shouted, raising his rifle. "Positions, everyone." The townsfolk scrambled to their posts, weapons at the ready. Clara grabbed her medical bag and headed to the front lines. She knew her place was with the people, offering help and hope wherever she could. The first wave of infected hit the barricades with a force that sent splinters flying. The defenders fired their weapons, the sharp cracks of gunfire mingling with the guttural growls of the infected. Clara moved through the chaos, administering the treatment to those who had been bitten in the initial attack. "Hold the line," Tom's voice rang out, a beacon of calm in the storm. "We can't let them through." Clara knelt beside a young man who had been bitten, injecting him with the treatment. "This should help," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil around her. "Stay strong." The infected were relentless, their numbers seemingly endless. Clara saw familiar faces among them, people she had known all her life, now twisted by the infection into something unrecognizable. Her heart ached, but she couldn't afford to dwell on it. They needed her. As the battle raged on, the infected began to break through the barricades. Clara's mind raced with strategies. "We need to fall back to the inner defenses," she shouted, rallying those around her. The defenders moved quickly, retreating to the next line of barricades. Clara stayed at the rear, making sure everyone got through. The infected poured through the broken barricades, a tide of madness and hunger. Tom and his deputies formed a tight line, their weapons firing in a deadly rhythm. Clara joined them, her medical bag ready for those who needed it. The infected surged forward, their sheer numbers overwhelming. "Hold the line," Tom repeated, his voice unwavering. "We can't let them through." Clara fought alongside the defenders, swinging a crowbar with all her strength. The weight of the weapon and the force of her blows reverberated through her body. She moved with purpose, every action a testament to her determination. The battle was a blur of movement and noise. Clara's muscles burned, but she refused to give in. She saw Tom go down, tackled by an infected, and her heart lurched. "Tom!" she screamed, rushing to his aid. She swung the crowbar, knocking the infected off him. Tom staggered to his feet, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "Thanks," he gasped, his eyes filled with gratitude. "We need to keep moving." The defenders regrouped, forming a tighter circle. The infected pressed in from all sides, their growls filling the air. Clara felt the weight of despair, but she refused to let it overwhelm her. "We're going to make it through this," she muttered to herself, determination hardening her resolve. Suddenly, a loud explosion rocked the ground. Clara turned to see a group of townsfolk had rigged a makeshift bomb, detonating it among the densest part of the infected horde. The explosion sent infected flying, creating a brief respite in the chaos. "That's our chance," Clara shouted. "Push them back." The defenders surged forward, using the momentary confusion to their advantage. Clara moved with them, her crowbar swinging in a deadly arc. The infected were pushed back, their numbers thinning. "We've got them on the run," Tom shouted, his voice filled with hope. "Keep pushing." Clara's arms ached, but she didn't stop. She saw Sharn fighting alongside them, her face set with determination. Together, they fought with everything they had, driving the infected back step by step. As the sun began to set, the tide of battle turned. The infected were driven back beyond the outer barricades, their numbers finally dwindling. Clara looked around at the exhausted but triumphant faces of her friends and neighbors. "We did it," she whispered, disbelief mingling with relief. Tom approached her, his face a mix of exhaustion and pride. "We held them off, Clara. We bought ourselves more time. Clara nodded, her heart swelling with hope. We did, and now we can keep working on the treatment. We're not out of the woods yet, but we have a fighting chance. The defenders began to regroup, tending to the wounded and reinforcing the barricades. Clara moved among them, offering help and encouragement. She knew the battle was far from over, but they had proven they could stand together and fight back. As night fell over Maplewood, the clinic stood as a symbol of resilience and hope. Clara knew they had taken a significant step forward, but the road ahead was still fraught with challenges. Together, they had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. "We're going to make it through this," Clara whispered to herself, her resolve unwavering. For Maplewood, for Sharn, for everyone. And as the first stars appeared in the night sky, Clara felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had faced the final showdown and survived. Now they would continue to fight together until the nightmare was finally over. The battle had left the town of Maplewood in a fragile state of exhausted victory. As dawn broke over the battered streets, the townspeople moved like shadows, tending to the wounded and reinforcing what remained of their defenses. Clara stood at the clinic's entrance, surveying the aftermath of the previous night's brutal fight. Tom approached her, his arm in a makeshift sling. "How are we holding up?" he asked, his voice thick with fatigue. Clara took a deep breath. "We've made it through the worst of it. The treatment is working, but we need to continue monitoring and adjusting it. We have to make sure we don't lose anyone else." Tom nodded. "We're getting reports from the watch posts. The infected seem to be retreating, at least for now. It's giving us some breathing room." Clara felt a glimmer of hope. "That's good news. We need to take advantage of this lull. Let's gather everyone for a meeting." The townsfolk assembled in the town square, their faces drawn but determined. Clara stood on the steps of the clinic, looking out at the people she had fought so hard to protect. "We've been through hell," Clara began, her voice carrying over the silent crowd. "But we're still here. The treatment is working, and we've proven that we can stand together and fight back." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Clara continued, "We need to keep pushing forward. We'll fortify our defenses, continue working on the treatment, and start planning for the long term. This isn't just about survival anymore. It's about rebuilding." Tom stepped forward, his presence a pillar of strength. "We'll organize patrols to keep watch for any signs of the infected. We'll also need volunteers to help with the repairs and to assist in the clinic." Hands shot up around the square. The sense of unity and purpose was palpable. Clara felt a swell of pride and hope. "Thank you, everyone. We can do this together." The rest of the day was a whirlwind of activity. Clara moved through the clinic, overseeing the treatment of the wounded and the administration of the new drug. The patients who had received it were showing signs of improvement, their symptoms gradually easing. Sharn worked alongside Clara, her presence a constant source of support. "We're really making a difference, aren't we?" she said, a hint of wonder in her voice. Clara smiled. "Yes, we are, and we're going to keep making a difference, one step at a time." As the sun set, casting a golden glow over Maplewood, the townspeople gathered again in the square. This time, the mood was lighter, filled with cautious optimism. Clara stood beside Tom and Sharn, feeling a sense of camaraderie and hope. Tom addressed the crowd. "We've been through a lot, but we've proven that we can survive and fight back. We're not out of the woods yet, but we're getting stronger every day." Clara stepped forward. "We need to keep working together, supporting each other. We'll continue to develop the treatment and find ways to strengthen our defenses. We're going to rebuild Maplewood, better and stronger than before." The crowd erupted in applause, a sound that filled Clara with renewed determination. She looked around at the faces of her friends and neighbors, each one a testament to their resilience and strength. As night fell, Clara and Sharn walked through the town, checking on the progress of the repairs and offering words of encouragement. The sense of unity was palpable, a beacon of hope in the darkness. Back at the clinic, Clara found a moment of quiet. She sat at her desk, reviewing the latest research and treatment results. The progress they had made was significant, but there was still much work to be done. Tom entered the room, his face etched with concern. We've had reports of a new group of survivors approaching the town. They've been through a lot and need medical attention. Clara stood, her resolve hardening. We'll help them, bring them in, and set up an isolation area to check for infections. We need to keep everyone safe. As the new survivors were brought in, Clara and her team worked tirelessly to assess and treat them. The gratitude in their eyes was a reminder of why they fought so hard. "We're going to be okay," Clara said softly to herself as she tended to a young girl with a fever. "We're going to rebuild and thrive." The night deepened, but the clinic remained a hub of activity and hope. Clara moved among the patients, her presence a calming influence. The treatment was working, and with each passing day, they were gaining ground. As the first light of dawn touched the clinic, Clara felt a sense of peace. They had faced unimaginable challenges, but they had come through stronger and more united. The road ahead would still be difficult, but they were no longer just surviving, they were building a future. "We're going to make it," Clara whispered to herself, her resolve unwavering. For Maplewood, for Sharn, for everyone. And as the sun rose over the town, Clara knew they were ready to face whatever came next. Together, they had found hope in the darkness and would continue to fight for a better tomorrow. Did you find the golden star in the video? If you did, leave a comment with the time you saw it to be mentioned in our next video. Thanks for spending a moment of your day with me. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It really, really helps a lot. If you don't, well, I'll still love you. Thanks for stopping by.